the ancient history of Westeros, few legends inspire such terror and fascination as the White Walkers, known as the Others in the oldest texts. These beings of ice and shadow emerged from the furthest reaches of the north, bringing with them a darkness that would reshape the very foundations of the world. Their story spans millennia, from their mysterious creation to their ultimate confrontation with the realm of the living. This is the complete chronicle of the White Walkers, their origins, their terrible reign during the Long Night, and their return to threaten Westeros once more, long before the Seven Kingdoms existed, before the Targaryens brought their dragons to Westeros, before even the Andals crossed the narrow sea with their seven-pointed star. The continent belonged to two peoples locked in an ancient and bitter war. The children of the forest, those small and mysterious beings who had dwelled among the weirwood groves since time immemorial, found themselves facing an existential threat unlike any they had ever known. The first men had arrived from across the eastern waters, bringing with them bronze axes and an insatiable hunger for land that would forever change the face of their world. For generations beyond counting, the children had lived in harmony with the natural world they considered sacred. Their connection to the old gods ran deeper than human understanding, flowing through the heart trees that stood as silent witnesses to their ancient magic. These beings, no taller than human children but possessing wisdom accumulated over centuries of life, had shaped their existence around the preservation of the forests that covered much of Westeros. The weirwoods, with their bone-pale bark and blood-red leaves, served not merely as trees, but as living embodiments of their faith, each carved face a conduit to powers that predated human civilization. The arrival of the first men shattered this timeless peace with the terrible efficiency of bronze meeting bark. These newcomers, tall and strong and numerous, viewed the endless forests not as sacred groves, but as obstacles to be cleared for their farms and settlements. They brought with them a revolutionary concept that the children had never encountered: the notion that land could be owned, claimed, and fundamentally altered to serve human needs. Where the children saw living spirits dwelling within each tree, the first men saw only timber and fertile soil waiting to be claimed. The war that followed would rage for thousands of years, leaving scars upon the land that can still be seen in the present day. The children, despite their mastery of nature, magic, and their ability to see through the eyes of beasts and birds, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and relentless advance of their human adversaries. Their ancient strongholds fell one by one as the first men pushed deeper into the continent, their bronze axes singing songs of destruction that echoed through the sacred groves. In their desperation, the children attempted increasingly dramatic magical interventions to halt the human advance. They called upon the old gods to shatter the Arm of Dorne, the land bridge that had allowed the first men to cross from Essos, hoping to prevent further reinforcements from reaching Westeros. When this failed to stop those already upon the continent, they turned their power toward the Neck, flooding vast areas to create the swamplands that would become known as the Moat Cailin. Yet still, the first men adapted and advanced, their hunger for land proving stronger than any obstacle the children could place in their path. As the centuries passed and their sacred forests continued to fall, the wisest among the children began to contemplate solutions that would have been unthinkable in more peaceful times. The green seers, those gifted with the ability to see across vast distances and peer into the currents of time itself, spoke in hushed tones of visions that showed paths to victory requiring sacrifices of unprecedented magnitude. These ancient beings, who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless seasons, understood that desperate times demanded desperate measures. The decision, when it finally came, emerged from a gathering of the most powerful green seers in a grove of ancient weirwoods whose names have been lost to history. There, beneath the watchful gaze of carved faces that had observed the world for millennia, they chose to create something that had never existed before. They would forge a weapon from the very essence of winter itself, binding the power of ice and death into a form that could stand against the seemingly unstoppable tide of human expansion. The ritual they devised drew upon magic older than recorded history, techniques whispered down through generations of green seers who had never imagined such knowledge would be needed for purposes of war. They required a human subject, one of the very first men whose advance had forced them to this extreme measure. The capture of such a subject proved no simple task, requiring cunning and coordination among beings more accustomed to avoiding human contact than seeking it. When they finally secured their unwilling participant, the children brought him to a grove of exceptional sanctity, where the largest and oldest weirwood in their territory stood sentinel over secrets that predated human memory. The heart tree rose like a pale giant from the forest floor, its massive trunk carved with a face whose expression seemed to shift between sorrow and terrible determination as the shadows moved across its ancient bark. The roots of this mighty tree delved deep into the earth, drawing power from sources that touched the very foundations of the world. The captive first man, bound with cords woven from living vines that tightened with each struggle, could only watch in growing terror as the children arranged themselves in a circle around the heart tree. Their leader, a figure whose age could be measured in centuries rather than decades, approached with something that gleamed like black ice in the dappled light filtering through the canopy above. The dragon glass dagger, forged from volcanic rock and shaped by magic into a blade sharper than any bronze weapon, seemed to drink in the light around it. What followed challenged every natural law that governed life and death in the known world. The green seer pressed the obsidian blade against the captive's chest, directly above his heart, and began to speak words in the old tongue that had not been heard since the dawn of the world. The other children joined their voices to hers, creating a harmony that resonated not just through the air, but through the very fabric of reality itself. The weirwood began to glow with an inner light, its carved face seeming to come alive as power flowed through its ancient wood. The transformation that began when the dragon glass pierced human flesh defied every expectation the children had harbored about their desperate gambit. They had hoped to create a guardian, a protector bound to their will who could stand against the human tide. Instead, they witnessed the birth of something far more terrible and magnificent than their ancient wisdom had prepared them to understand. The man's scream echoed through the grove as his very essence was rewritten by forces that cared nothing for the intentions of his creators. His skin grew pale as winter moonlight, taking on a translucent quality that seemed to glow with its own cold radiance. His eyes, once brown like rich earth, transformed into orbs of ice-blue fire that held depths no human gaze had ever possessed. The transformation spread through his body like frost forming on glass, changing not just his appearance but his fundamental nature. Where once had been a mortal man with the usual concerns of food and shelter and the passage of time, there now stood something that existed beyond such mundane limitations. The children watched in growing horror as their creation rose to his feet, the vines that had bound him falling away like brittle leaves. The being that had once been human looked upon his makers with eyes that held no gratitude, no loyalty, no recognition of the purpose for which he had been created. In that terrible moment, the green seers realized that their desperate gambit had succeeded far beyond their intentions and failed catastrophically in its ultimate goal. They had created not a weapon they could wield, but a force of nature they could never hope to control. The first White Walker stood in the sacred grove like winter given form, and in his frozen gaze, the children of the forest saw the reflection of their own doom. The being they had crafted to save their people would instead become the architect of terrors that would haunt the world for millennia to come. The ancient magic they had wielded with such confidence had taken their design and twisted it into something that served purposes far darker than they had ever imagined possible. Thus began the age of the Others, born from desperation and nurtured by magic that proved far more dangerous than its wielders had ever suspected. The children of the forest had sought to preserve their ancient way of life, but instead they had unleashed upon the world a threat that would grow to encompass far more than the human invasion they had feared. The first White Walker would not remain alone for long, and the power that had created him would soon spread like winter's embrace across the entirety of the known world. The transformation of the first White Walker marked not an ending, but a terrible beginning. For the power that had reshaped one human soul would prove far more ambitious in its ultimate design. In the land of always winter, that frozen realm beyond the furthest reaches of human knowledge, something ancient and patient had been waiting for precisely such an opportunity. The creation of the Night King, as he would come to be known, served as a key that unlocked forces which had slumbered since the world was young, forces that hungered for dominion over all living things. The seasons themselves seemed to respond to this new presence in the world, as if the very turning of the earth had been disrupted by the introduction of something that stood outside the natural order. Where once the cycles of summer and winter had followed patterns known since time immemorial, now the cold began to linger with unnatural persistence. The snow fell heavier and remained longer. The ice grew thicker upon the lakes and rivers, and the wind carried with it a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of every living creature it touched. In those first years following his creation, The Night King wandered the frozen wastes beyond human settlement, learning the extent of his new powers and the terrible hunger that drove him ever forward. He discovered that death held no dominion over him, that cold was not his enemy but his ally, and that the boundary between life and death had become something he could cross at will. Most significantly, he learned that he was not destined to remain alone in his frozen existence, for the power that had created him could be shared with others who proved worthy of such a dark gift. The first of his new brothers emerged from among the scattered bands of wildlings who had ventured too far north in search of game during the increasingly harsh winters. These hardy folk, accustomed to surviving in conditions that would kill softer southern dwellers, found themselves facing something far more dangerous than mere weather. The Night King moved among them like a winter storm given form, selecting those whose strength and will impressed him enough to merit transformation rather than simple death. The process by which he created new White Walkers remained a mystery that would endure for millennia, though those few who witnessed it and lived to tell the tale spoke of rituals conducted in groves of frozen trees where the very air seemed to crystallize with power. The chosen subjects, whether willing or not, found themselves changed in ways that went far beyond the physical transformation their new master had undergone. They retained their intelligence and much of their original personality, but these qualities became twisted to serve purposes that no living being could fully comprehend. As their numbers grew, so too did their understanding of the powers they wielded. They learned to shape ice into weapons that could cut through steel as easily as summer heat cuts through snow, creating blades that gleamed like crystal and sang with supernatural sharpness when they moved through the air. Their armor, if it could be called such, seemed to form from the very moisture in the atmosphere around them, creating protection that shifted and flowed like living frost, while remaining harder than any metal forged by human hands. The true revelation of their potential came with their first encounters with death itself. When a White Walker's blade found its mark and ended a life, the corpse did not remain still for long. Within moments of death, the body would begin to stir with new and terrible purpose, rising to serve its killer with absolute loyalty and supernatural strength. These Whites, as they came to be known, retained none of their former personality or memories, existing solely as extensions of their master's will and hunger for conquest. The implications of this power became clear as the White Walkers began their first systematic campaigns against the scattered human settlements that dotted the northern reaches of Westeros. Each victory brought them not merely the satisfaction of conquest, but an increase in their military strength, as every fallen enemy became a new soldier in their growing army. The dead felt no pain, needed no food or rest, and fought with a relentless determination that unnerved even the bravest human warriors. The wildling clans, despite their reputation for fierce independence and fighting prowess, found themselves utterly unprepared for an enemy that could not be reasoned with, bribed, or intimidated. Their traditional tactics of raid and counter-raid proved useless against foes who seemed to anticipate their every move and showed no interest in the usual spoils of war. The White Walkers wanted neither gold nor women, nor territory in any conventional sense, seeking instead something far more fundamental and terrifying in its implications. Word of these early encounters spread southward like wildfire, carried by the few survivors who managed to escape the systematic destruction of their communities. The tales they told seemed so fantastic, so removed from any normal understanding of warfare, that many dismissed them as the ravings of minds broken by trauma and loss. Yet, the evidence of destruction was undeniable, and the growing stream of refugees told a consistent story of an enemy unlike any the world had ever known. The White Walkers themselves seemed to understand the psychological impact of their reputation, often leaving scenes of carnage arranged in patterns that spoke to some alien intelligence behind the destruction. Bodies would be found arranged in spirals or other geometric designs, their faces frozen in expressions of terror that suggested they had seen something beyond human comprehension in their final moments. These displays served not merely as warnings, but as proclamations of power that transcended anything mortals could imagine or resist. As their campaign expanded, the White Walkers demonstrated an understanding of strategy that belied any notion that they were merely mindless forces of destruction. They struck first at isolated settlements where resistance would be minimal and the chance of survivors escaping to warn others was small. They used the terrain to their advantage, appearing from blizzards that seemed to follow in their wake and disappearing into ice storms that made pursuit impossible. The winter that accompanied their advance grew longer and more severe with each passing year, until seasons themselves seemed to lose all meaning in the affected regions. Where once the cycle of planting and harvest had marked the passage of time, now there was only an endless expanse of cold that made normal life impossible. The very animals began to flee southward in great migrations, as if sensing that something fundamental about the natural order had been disrupted beyond any hope of repair. The transformation of the landscape itself became one of the most unnerving aspects of the White Walker advance. Lakes that had never frozen solid became solid ice for years at a time, while rivers ceased to flow and became highways for the advancing army of the dead. Trees that had weathered countless winters before withered and died, their branches becoming twisted sculptures of ice that reflected the alien beauty of their new masters. Human settlements that fell to the White Walkers did not simply disappear, but were transformed into something far more sinister. The buildings remained standing, but the warmth of human habitation was replaced by a cold that seemed to emanate from the very stones. These places became waypoints in the White Walker advance, staging areas where the growing army of whites could be organized and directed toward new targets. The psychological warfare employed by the White Walkers proved as effective as their supernatural abilities in breaking human resistance. Survivors spoke of the terrible silence that preceded their attacks, a quiet so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself. In this unnatural stillness, the only noise would be the soft whisper of snow falling and the distant sound of ice cracking under invisible pressure, building tension until the attack came with sudden and overwhelming force. Perhaps most disturbing of all, were the reports of White Walkers who seemed to take particular interest in human children, not killing them immediately, but carrying them away for purposes that defied understanding. These abductions suggested that the invaders had plans that extended far beyond simple conquest, implying a long-term strategy that viewed humans not merely as enemies to be destroyed, but as resources to be harvested for unknown purposes. The growing army of the dead began to include not only human whites, but reanimated animals of every description. Massive bears stalked through the frozen landscape with ice blue eyes, while dire wolves that had fallen to White Walker blades rose again to hunt their former packmates. Most terrifying of all were the reports of ancient creatures, beasts that had been dead and buried for years or even decades, clawing their way from the frozen ground to join the supernatural host. As the years passed and the White Walker advance continued inexorably southward, it became clear that the world was witnessing something unprecedented in its scope and ambition. This was not a typical war of conquest driven by human motivations of greed, power, or territory. Instead, it represented something far more fundamental and terrifying, a systematic assault on the very concept of life itself that seemed destined to continue until every warm-blooded creature in the known world had been claimed by the eternal cold. The long night had begun in earnest, and those few who understood the true nature of the threat facing them realized that humanity stood on the precipice of an extinction more complete than any that had come before. The White Walkers were not merely another enemy to be defeated through conventional means, but a force of nature that challenged the very foundations upon which mortal civilization had been built. The age of ice and death had dawned, and only the most desperate measures would offer any hope of survival for the world of the living. The advance of the White Walkers had transformed the known world into a realm of perpetual winter, where hope seemed as distant as the memory of summer's warmth. Yet, even in the darkest hours of the long night, when the armies of the dead had swept across vast swaths of Westeros like an unstoppable tide of ice and death, the spark of resistance refused to be extinguished entirely. In scattered strongholds and hidden refuges, the survivors of humanity's greatest trial began to understand that their salvation would require more than conventional warfare or the strength of individual heroes. The alliance that would ultimately stand against the White Walkers emerged not from the halls of great lords or the councils of kings, but from the desperate recognition that ancient enmities had become meaningless in the face of extinction. The first men, those same colonizers whose arrival had sparked the original conflict with the children of the forest, found themselves approaching their former enemies with offers of cooperation that would have been unthinkable in any other circumstances. The proposal was simple in concept, yet revolutionary in its implications. Two peoples who had warred for millennia would join their strength against a threat that endangered both. The children of the forest, despite their role in creating the very menace that now threatened all life, possessed knowledge and abilities that proved essential to any hope of victory. Their understanding of the old magic, their connection to the ancient powers that flowed through the heart trees, and Their mastery of dragonglass weapons offered resources that no human army could match through conventional means. Most importantly, they carried the burden of responsibility for having unleashed the White Walkers upon the world, a guilt that drove them to extraordinary measures in seeking to undo the catastrophe their desperation had wrought. The negotiations between these unlikely allies took place in hidden groves where weirwood trees provided both sanctuary and witness to oaths that would reshape the fundamental order of Westeros. The terms agreed upon went far beyond simple military cooperation, establishing principles of coexistence that recognized the legitimacy of both peoples' claims to the continent. The first men would retain the open lands they had claimed for their farms and settlements, while the children would hold dominion over the deep forests that remained sacred to their beliefs and necessary for their survival. Yet, even as this historic pact was sealed beneath the carved faces of the ancient gods, both sides understood that diplomacy alone would not suffice to turn back the tide of death that continued its relentless advance. The White Walkers had grown too numerous, their army of whites too vast, and their mastery of winter itself too complete for any conventional strategy to offer hope of success. What was needed was something unprecedented, a champion whose very nature transcended the normal limitations of mortal flesh, and whose destiny was intertwined with powers greater than any single individual could command. The legends speak of multiple heroes who rose during this darkest hour, their stories becoming so intertwined over the millennia that separating historical fact from mythic embellishment has proven impossible for even the most learned maesters. In Westeros, the tale centers upon the last hero, a figure whose very name suggests both ultimate hope and final desperation. This legendary warrior was said to have undertaken a quest that would either save the world of the living or mark the end of humanity's resistance to the forces of death and ice. The journey of the last hero became the stuff of songs and stories told around countless fires during the long nights that followed, though the details varied depending on who told the tale and how many generations had passed since the events themselves. What remained consistent across all versions was the essential nature of his sacrifice, the understanding that victory would require not merely courage or skill at arms, but a willingness to pay prices that would humble lesser souls. The hero who would stand against the White Walkers must be prepared to lose everything in pursuit of salvation for others. Across the narrow sea, in the ancient realm of ET, where the long night had brought similar devastation, the same period gave birth to legends of Azor Ahai, the warrior who would forge from fire and blood a sword capable of driving back the darkness itself. The forging of Lightbringer, as the blade came to be known, required sacrifices that tested the very limits of what one soul could endure. 3 times Azor Ahai attempted to create his legendary weapon, and twice the blade shattered when put to the test, teaching him that true power required prices beyond imagination. The first attempt saw him labor for 30 days and 30 nights, folding steel and fire into a sword of exceptional beauty and sharpness. Yet, when he sought to temper the blade in water, it cracked and broke, teaching him that some weapons required more than craftsmanship to achieve their true potential. Undaunted, he began again, this time working for 50 days and 50 nights, creating a blade even more magnificent than the first. When he sought to temper this second sword by driving it through the heart of a lion, the steel shattered against the great cat's courage, revealing that blood alone was insufficient to forge a weapon capable of challenging the darkness. The third and final attempt demanded a sacrifice that would haunt Azor Ahai for the remainder of his days, though it would ultimately provide the power necessary to drive back the forces of ice and death. For 100 days and 100 nights he labored, pouring not just his skill, but his very soul into the creation of a blade that would embody the essence of fire itself. When the time came for tempering, he understood with terrible clarity what the completion of his weapon would require. With tears streaming down his face, he drove the red-hot steel through the heart of his beloved wife, Nissa Nissa, her sacrifice transforming the sword into something that burned with its own inner light. Lightbringer, forged from love and loss and tempered in the blood of innocence, became more than merely a weapon in the conventional sense. Those who witnessed it in battle spoke of a blade that blazed like a falling star, cutting through the supernatural darkness that surrounded the White Walkers and reducing their ice weapons to vapor with each clash. The sword seemed to generate its own heat, melting snow for yards around its wielder and turning the very air it passed through into visible flame that danced and flickered with each movement. The campaigns that followed marked the turning point in humanity's struggle against extinction. Though the battles themselves were unlike any that had come before or would come again, the alliance of first men and children of the forest brought together forces that complemented each other in ways that neither could have achieved alone. Human warriors provided the numbers and conventional military might necessary to engage the armies of whites, while the children contributed magical support that could neutralize some of the supernatural advantages their enemies possessed. The discovery and mass production of dragonglass weapons proved crucial to the eventual success of the resistance. The children of the forest, with their deep understanding of the volcanic glass and the techniques needed to shape it into effective tools of war, worked tirelessly to arm human warriors with blades that could actually harm the White Walkers themselves. This knowledge, combined with the courage of mortal soldiers willing to face creatures of ice and shadow, created the first real hope that the long night might eventually end. The battles of this period defied normal military logic, as the Alliance forces found themselves fighting not merely against living enemies, but against the very landscape itself. The White Walkers had transformed the regions they controlled into extensions of their will, where blizzards struck with tactical precision and the ground itself could open to disgorge whites that had been buried in the frozen earth. Victory required not just defeating visible enemies, but somehow breaking the supernatural influence that had turned winter from a season into a weapon. The climactic confrontation, known to history as the Battle for the Dawn, represented the culmination of everything both sides had learned during years of increasingly desperate warfare. The forces of life gathered their remaining strength for what all understood would be the final test, a battle whose outcome would determine whether the sun would ever rise again on a world free from the dominion of ice and death. The exact location of this legendary battle has been lost to time, though various accounts place it everywhere, from the frozen shores of the shivering sea to the heart of what would later become the Neck. What happened during those crucial hours remains one of history's greatest mysteries, shrouded in legend and complicated by contradictory accounts that may reflect different perspectives on the same events or entirely separate battles occurring simultaneously across the continent. Some versions speak of single combat between the greatest heroes and the Night King himself, while others describe a massive engagement involving tens of thousands of combatants on each side, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. As dawn approached, the end of the long night came not with the total destruction of the White Walkers, as many songs suggest, but with their sudden and mysterious withdrawal to the furthest reaches of the north. Whether this retreat represented defeat, strategic withdrawal, or fulfillment of some alien purpose known only to the others themselves, has remained a subject of debate among scholars and storytellers for thousands of years. What cannot be disputed is that winter's unnatural grip upon the world was broken, allowing the cycles of season to resume their normal patterns and life to flourish once again in the lands that had been given over to ice and death. The victory came at a cost that would echo through the ages, transforming the survivors as much as it had saved them. The heroes who had stood against the darkness carried scars both visible and hidden, their experiences during the long night having shown them truths about the nature of existence that could never be forgotten or shared with those who had not witnessed the same horrors. The alliance between first men and children of the forest, forged in desperation and sealed in blood, would endure long enough to lay the foundations for a more peaceful world, though the deep changes wrought by the conflict would influence the development of Westerosi civilization for millennia to come. The legends of Azor Ahai and the Last Hero became more than simple tales of heroism, evolving into prophecies that spoke of the eventual return of darkness and the need for new champions to stand against it. These stories served both as inspiration for future generations and as warnings that the victory achieved during the War for the Dawn was not necessarily permanent, that the forces of ice and shadow might someday rise again to threaten all that lived and breathed beneath the Sunday. In the aftermath of the long night's end and the mysterious withdrawal of the White Walkers to the furthest reaches of the north, the survivors of humanity's greatest trial faced a challenge that would prove nearly as daunting as the war itself. The victory against the forces of ice and death had been won through desperate measures and at tremendous cost. But those who remained understood with sobering clarity that their triumph was incomplete. The White Walkers had retreated rather than been destroyed, disappearing into the land of always winter, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind the terrible knowledge that what had withdrawn might someday return. The alliance between the first men and the children of the forest, forged in the crucible of shared desperation, now turned its attention to the monumental task of ensuring that the horrors of the long night could never again threaten the world of the living. The solution they conceived would become one of the most ambitious construction projects in the history of the known world, a barrier so massive and enduring that its very existence would reshape the geography and politics of Westeros for thousands of years to come. The Wall, as it came to be known to future generations, represented far more than simple fortification against a defeated enemy. The structure they envisioned would stretch across the entire northern border of the continent, from the frozen shores of the Bay of Seals in the west to the icy waters of the shivering sea in the east. This barrier would stand 300 feet high and 700 feet thick, built from ice so pure and hard that it would endure for millennia without melting even under the warmth of summer suns. The scale of this undertaking defied conventional understanding of what mortal beings could accomplish through labor alone. The official histories, written by maesters thousands of years after the construction's completion, speak of massive blocks of ice cut from frozen lakes and rivers, dragged to the construction site by teams of giants and hoisted into place through an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys that would have challenged the engineering capabilities of any civilization. Yet those who examined the wall with careful attention to its construction details found evidence that suggested a more complex truth behind its creation. The ice itself possessed qualities that seemed to transcend natural law, remaining frozen solid even when exposed to direct flame or the heat of forges. The blocks fitted together with precision that would have challenged even master stonemasons working with carefully cut granite, creating joints so seamless that the entire structure appeared to have been carved from a single massive glacier. Most mysteriously of all, the wall seemed to generate its own cold, creating an aura of winter that extended for miles in either direction and never diminished regardless of season or weather. These characteristics led many scholars to conclude that the wall's construction had required more than human engineering and giant strength to achieve its final form. The children of the forest, with their mastery of magic and deep understanding of natural forces, had almost certainly played a crucial role in binding the ice with powers that ensured its permanence. Some accounts spoke of ancient spells woven into the very foundation of the wall, protective enchantments that would not only maintain the structure's physical integrity, but also serve as a barrier against the supernatural forces that might seek to breach it. The most compelling evidence for magical involvement came from examination of the wall's foundation, where massive stones inscribed with symbols from the old tongue had been discovered beneath the ice. These foundation stones, invisible to casual observation but revealed to those who ventured into the deep cellars of the wall's castles, bore markings that predated any known human writing system. The symbols themselves seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, suggesting they had been carved not merely to record information, but to channel forces that existed beyond normal understanding. Brandon Stark, known to history as Bran the Builder, emerged as the central figure in the wall's construction and the establishment of the institutions that would guard it for millennia to come. This legendary king of the First Men possessed a vision that extended far beyond the immediate need for defense, understanding that the barrier they were creating would require permanent guardianship by those dedicated to its maintenance and defense. The Night's Watch, as he conceived it, would be more than a military organization. It would become a sacred brotherhood, sworn to eternal vigilance against the return of darkness. The men who first took the black, as joining the Night's Watch came to be known, were drawn from the finest warriors and wisest leaders among the survivors of the long night. These volunteers understood the magnitude of the threat they had faced and the importance of ensuring that future generations would be prepared should the White Walkers ever emerge from their northern exile. Their vows, spoken before heart trees and witnessed by both the old gods and the new, bound them not only to celibacy and obedience, but to a lifetime of service that would end only with death. The original mandate of the Night's Watch extended far beyond simple border defense, encompassing responsibilities that reflected the complex nature of the threat they were meant to guard against. These early brothers were tasked not only with maintaining the wall's physical integrity, but also with preserving the knowledge and weapons that had proven effective against the White Walkers. The techniques for working dragonglass into effective weapons, the tactical innovations that had emerged during the long night, and the magical protections that had proven crucial to survival, all became part of the Watch's sacred duty to preserve and pass down to future generations. The construction of 19 castles along the wall's length provided both practical fortification and symbolic representation of humanity's commitment to eternal vigilance. Each castle was positioned to provide overlapping fields of observation and mutual support, ensuring that no section of the wall could be breached without immediate detection and response. The largest and most important of these fortifications, Castle Black, became the Order's headquarters and the seat of the Lord Commander, who would lead the Watch in its sacred mission. The early years of the Night's Watch were marked by a sense of purpose and urgency that reflected the fresh memory of the long night's horrors. The men who served during this period maintained constant patrols beyond the wall, not in search of human enemies, but to watch for any signs that the White Walkers might be stirring in their northern strongholds. These ranging missions, dangerous beyond measure, provided early warning of supernatural activity, while also serving to map and understand the vast wilderness that lay beyond human civilization. The organizational structure established by Brandon the Builder proved remarkably durable, creating clear chains of command and responsibility that would endure for thousands of years with minimal modification. The Lord Commander held supreme authority over all aspects of the Watch's operations, while the First Ranger commanded all activities beyond the wall, and the First Steward managed the complex logistics of maintaining such a vast operation in the harsh northern climate. This division of responsibilities ensured that the Watch could function effectively, regardless of the personal strengths or weaknesses of individual leaders. The recruitment of new brothers during these early centuries drew from a different pool of candidates than would later become common. Rather than serving as a destination for criminals and outcasts, the Night's Watch attracted younger sons of noble houses who saw service on the wall as an honor comparable to knighthood. The Order's reputation for courage and sacrifice made it a destination for those seeking to prove their worth, while the knowledge that the Watch stood as humanity's primary defense against existential threat gave their service a meaning that transcended personal ambition. The rituals and traditions that grew up around the Night's Watch reflected both its sacred mission and the harsh realities of life on the wall. The taking of vows became an elaborate ceremony conducted in the crypts beneath Winterfell for those who followed the old gods, or in septs for those who had adopted the faith of the Seven. These ceremonies emphasized the finality of the commitment being made, the understanding that those who joined the Watch were surrendering not just their former lives, but any hope of the ordinary human experiences of marriage, children, and inherited legacy. The relationship between the Night's Watch and the realm it protected was formalized through a series of agreements that ensured the Order would receive the support necessary to maintain its vigil. The great houses of the North pledged to provide supplies, equipment, and recruits, while the kings who ruled from Winterfell granted the Watch broad autonomy in governing the territories under its protection. This arrangement created a unique institution that existed both within and apart from the normal feudal structure of Westeros, answerable to no lord save the ancient duty that had called it into being. As the decades passed and the immediate memory of the long night began to fade, subtle changes began to appear in both the wall itself and the organization dedicated to its defense. The massive structure continued to grow, not through human construction, but through the accumulation of ice and snow that somehow bonded permanently to the original edifice. This natural growth increased both the wall's height and its apparent strength, creating an increasingly formidable barrier that seemed to pulse with its own quiet power. The Night's Watch gradually evolved from an organization of volunteers motivated by recent memory of supernatural threat into a more conventional military order, focused primarily on defending against human incursions from beyond the wall. The wildling clans that had survived the long night began to organize themselves into larger groups, some of which occasionally tested the wall's defenses or attempted to find passages through the ancient barrier. These conflicts, while dangerous, were fundamentally different from the existential threat that had originally motivated the Watch's creation. Yet, even as its focus shifted toward more mundane concerns, the Night's Watch never entirely forgot its original purpose. In the deepest vaults of Castle Black, weapons of dragonglass were carefully maintained and preserved, while the old knowledge of how to combat supernatural enemies was recorded in texts that were studied by each new generation of officers. The horn calls that could summon aid from neighboring castles included specific signals that had been established to warn of White Walker activity, though these particular calls would go unused for so long that their meaning would eventually be forgotten by all but the most scholarly members of the Order. The wall stood as more than mere fortification. It became a symbol of humanity's determination to learn from the past and prepare for future challenges that might exceed normal understanding. Its construction represented the highest achievement of cooperation between former enemies united by common purpose while the Night's Watch that defended it embodied the principle that some duties transcended personal interest or political ambition. Together, they formed a legacy of the long night that would endure long after the last witness to those terrible events had passed into legend, standing as eternal testament to both the darkness that had once threatened to consume the world and the courage that had ultimately driven it back into the frozen wastes where it belonged. The centuries that followed the construction of the wall witnessed the gradual transformation of both the Night's Watch and the very nature of the threat they had been created to guard against. As the immediate memory of the long night faded from living recollection and passed into the realm of legend, the men who took the black found themselves facing challenges that their founders could never have anticipated. The wall itself had become so effective a barrier that contact with the lands beyond became increasingly rare, creating an isolation that would prove both blessing and curse for those sworn to defend it. It was during this period of apparent peace and security that one of the most disturbing chapters in the Night's Watch's history began to unfold, a tale that would be whispered in the darkest corners of Castle Black for thousands of years to come. The 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, whose name was deliberately erased from all records following his downfall, would become known to history only by the title that marked his ultimate corruption, the Night's King, a designation that spoke to crimes so heinous that even speaking his true name was considered an invitation to darkness. The man who would become the Night's King had risen to command of the Night's Watch through the conventional means that marked most successful careers within the order. He had distinguished himself as a ranger of exceptional skill and courage, leading patrols beyond the wall that returned with intelligence about the movements of wildling clans and the changing conditions in the haunted forest. His tactical acumen and natural leadership abilities had earned him the respect of his brothers and the trust of his superiors, making his eventual elevation to Lord Commander seem both inevitable and entirely appropriate. The transformation that would damn him began with what appeared to be a routine ranging mission beyond the wall, an expedition into the far north that was intended to investigate reports of unusual activity in regions that had remained quiet since the end of the long night. What the patrol discovered in those frozen wastes would forever alter the course of the Night's Watch and reveal that the supernatural threats of the past had not been entirely vanquished by humanity's ancient victory over the forces of ice and death. The encounter took place in a grove of ancient weirwoods whose twisted branches bore witness to secrets that predated human settlement of the continent. There, amidst trees whose carved faces seemed to weep frozen tears in the perpetual twilight of the far north, the Lord Commander came face to face with a being whose very existence challenged everything the Night's Watch believed about the current state of the world. The woman who appeared before him possessed skin as pale as fresh snow and eyes that blazed with the cold blue fire that marked her as something far removed from ordinary humanity. Whether this being was one of the original White Walkers who had somehow survived the War for the Dawn, or a creation of more recent vintage, would remain a mystery that scholars would debate for millennia to come. What could not be disputed was the immediate and overwhelming effect her presence had upon the Lord Commander. who found himself drawn to her with a fascination that transcended rational thought, or the sacred vows that bound him to celibacy and duty. The attraction he felt was not merely physical, but something far more fundamental, as if she represented the missing half of his very soul. The courtship that followed, if such a term could be applied to the supernatural seduction that ensued, took place over the course of several clandestine meetings in the haunted forest beyond the wall. The Lord Commander began making frequent ranging missions into the far north, ostensibly to maintain vigilance against potential threats, but actually to continue his forbidden liaison with the mysterious woman who had captured his heart and soul. His fellow brothers noticed changes in his demeanor and behavior, but attributed them to the stresses of command rather than the darker truth that was slowly consuming their leader from within. The transformation became undeniable when the Lord Commander brought his pale queen back to the wall itself, installing her in the Lord Commander's tower at the Night Fort with a ceremony that perverted every sacred tradition the Night's Watch had maintained since its founding. Rather than the simple vows of obedience and celibacy that marked admission to the order, he proclaimed himself her king and her his queen, declaring that the ancient rules no longer applied to those who had transcended mortal limitations through love that existed beyond the boundaries of life and death. The corruption of the Night's Watch that followed revealed the full extent of the supernatural influence the Pale Queen wielded over those who fell under her sway through what could only be described as sorcerous means. She and her self-proclaimed king began to bend the will of the other brothers to their purposes, transforming men who had once been paragons of duty and honor into willing servants of powers that existed in direct opposition to everything the Watch had been created to defend against. The exact nature of these strange sorceries was never fully understood, but their effects were undeniable and terrifying in their implications. For 13 long years, the Night's King ruled from the Night Fort with his pale queen at his side, turning the ancient fortress into something that bore little resemblance to its original purpose as humanity's bulwark against the darkness. The men under his command ceased their patrols of the wall's southern approaches, abandoning their duty to protect the realm in favor of activities that served purposes known only to their corrupted leadership. More disturbing still were the reports that began to filter south of strange lights seen burning in the Night Fort's towers, and sounds that resembled human voices raised in prayers to gods whose names could not be spoken aloud. The true nature of the Night's King's crimes only became apparent when his reign was finally brought to an end through the combined efforts of the Starks of Winterfell and the King beyond the Wall, an unprecedented alliance between sworn enemies who recognized that some threats transcended their traditional conflicts. The investigation that followed the liberation of the Night Fort revealed evidence of practices so abhorrent that the details were deliberately suppressed, recorded only in the most secret archives, where they could serve as warnings to future generations without corrupting those who might encounter them unprepared. Central to these forbidden activities were the sacrifices that the Night's King had been making to the others themselves, offerings that suggested some form of ongoing contact and cooperation with the very enemies the Night's Watch had been created to guard against. The exact nature of these sacrifices followed patterns that would later be recognized in the activities of wildlings like Craster, involving the systematic offering of human lives to creatures that existed beyond the wall in exchange for protection and supernatural favor that came at prices too terrible to contemplate. The discovery of the Black Gate deep beneath the Night Fort provided crucial evidence of how these crimes had been carried out without detection by the broader realm. This magical portal, constructed of what appeared to be living weirwood and activated by spoken passwords in the old tongue, allowed passage through the wall itself without the knowledge or consent of the men stationed at other castles along its length. The gate's very existence suggested that communication and travel between the lands on either side of the wall had been possible throughout the Night's Watch's history, raising disturbing questions about other secrets that might have been hidden in the organization's past. The mechanisms by which the Black Gate operated defied normal understanding of both engineering and magic, responding only to members of the Night's Watch who spoke the correct words while demonstrating the proper intent. The portal itself appeared to be carved from a single massive piece of weirwood whose age exceeded that of the wall itself, suggesting that this passage had existed long before the barrier's construction and had been deliberately incorporated into the fortifications for purposes that the official histories chose not to record in detail. The implications of the Black Gate's existence extended far beyond the crimes of the Night's King, suggesting that the relationship between the Night's Watch and the supernatural forces beyond the wall had always been more complex than the simple narrative of eternal vigilance against an implacable enemy would suggest. The possibility that some form of accommodation or treaty had been negotiated during the original construction of the wall, perhaps involving limited sacrifice in exchange for the other's withdrawal to the far north, provided a context for understanding how such activities could have continued for 13 years without detection. The ritualistic nature of the Night's King's offerings, combined with the systematic way in which they were carried out, pointed toward the existence of established protocols that had been passed down through generations of Night's Watch leadership. These dark traditions, hidden beneath the surface of the Order's noble mission, suggested that the true history of humanity's relationship with the White Walkers was far more complex and morally ambiguous than the heroic tales sung by bards and recorded by maesters would have future generations believe. The aftermath of the Night's King's downfall brought sweeping changes to the Night's Watch that were designed to prevent any recurrence of such corruption, though these reforms also served to obscure the deeper questions his reign had raised about the organization's true purpose and history. The records of his rule were systematically destroyed or hidden away. His name was struck from all official histories, and new safeguards were put in place to ensure that no future Lord Commander could wield the kind of unchecked authority that had made his crimes possible. Yet, despite these efforts to bury the past, the legacy of the Night's King endured in the form of stories and warnings that were passed down through the generations of men who served on the wall. The Night Fort itself, tainted by association with his crimes, was eventually abandoned in favor of other castles that carried no such dark associations, though the fortress remained standing as a monument to the dangers of allowing duty to be corrupted by forces that promised power at prices too terrible to calculate. The tale of the Night's King served as a reminder that even the most sacred institutions could be corrupted when their guardians lost sight of their true purpose, and that the threats facing humanity came not only from obvious enemies, but from the subtle temptations that could turn protectors into the very dangers they had sworn to guard against. His story would be remembered not as an aberration, but as a warning that eternal vigilance required guarding not only against external threats, but against the darkness that could emerge from within when duty was abandoned in favor of desires that promised everything while delivering only damnation. The downfall of the Night's King and the reforms that followed his reign marked the beginning of an era that would stretch across thousands of years, during which the White Walkers retreated so completely from human awareness that their very existence gradually transformed from historical fact into legend, and from legend into the stuff of children's tales told to ensure good behavior during the long winter nights. This period of apparent dormancy would prove to be one of the most significant in the history of Westeros, not because of the great events that occurred, but because of the profound forgetting that took place as generation after generation passed without any direct contact with the supernatural forces that had once threatened to consume the world. The wall continued to stand as humanity's great bulwark against the unknown. Its massive ice barrier growing ever taller and more imposing with each passing century as snow and ice accumulated upon its ancient foundations. Yet, the meaning of this protection gradually shifted in the minds of those who lived in its shadow, evolving from a necessary defense against existential threat into a more conventional border fortification designed to keep out the wildling clans who roamed the lands beyond. The Night's Watch that defended it underwent a corresponding transformation, slowly losing touch with the supernatural purpose that had originally called the Order into being. The process of forgetting was not immediate, but rather unfolded across generations, with the inexorable persistence of erosion wearing away the face of a mountain. The first generation of brothers who served after the Night's King's downfall retained vivid memories of the corruption that had nearly destroyed their order, maintaining careful vigilance against any signs that the ancient threats might be stirring once again. They conducted their patrols beyond the wall with the understanding that they were watching for more than human enemies, keeping the old knowledge alive through training exercises that prepared their successors to recognize supernatural dangers. As decades passed into centuries, however, the absence of any actual encounters with White Walkers began to take its toll on the collective memory and institutional culture of the Night's Watch. The elaborate preparations for supernatural warfare that had once been considered essential gradually came to be seen as antiquated traditions maintained more from habit than necessity. The weapons of dragonglass that had been so carefully preserved were relegated to dusty armories, where they gathered cobwebs alongside other relics of a bygone age. their true purpose slowly forgotten by men who had never seen their deadly effectiveness demonstrated. The transformation of the Night's Watch from sacred brotherhood to glorified prison guard reflected broader changes taking place throughout the Seven Kingdoms as the feudal system matured and centralized authority grew stronger. The great houses that had once considered service on the wall to be an honor began to view it instead as a convenient dumping ground for younger sons, criminals, and political embarrassments who needed to be removed from society without the messiness of actual execution. This shift in recruitment patterns inevitably altered the character of the order itself, as men seeking redemption or escape replaced those motivated by genuine dedication to protecting the realm. The decline in quality among new recruits was matched by a corresponding deterioration in the Night's Watch's broader mission and capability. The 19 castles that had once housed thousands of dedicated defenders were gradually abandoned as the Order's numbers dwindled and resources became increasingly scarce. The complex network of patrols and communications that had once provided early warning of threats from beyond the wall gave way to a more reactive posture, focused primarily on responding to wildling raids and maintaining basic border security. Perhaps most significantly, the knowledge and traditions that had once defined the Night's Watch's supernatural mission began to fade from active practice into the realm of half-remembered ritual and meaningless ceremony. The horn calls that had been established to warn of White Walker activity became confused with more mundane signals, their original meanings preserved only in texts that few brothers bothered to study. The tactical formations and combat techniques that had proven effective against creatures of ice and shadow were replaced by conventional military drills better suited to fighting human opponents with human limitations. Yet, even as the Night's Watch itself forgot its true purpose, traces of the ancient knowledge persisted in unexpected places throughout the lands beyond the wall. Among the wildling clans who roamed the haunted forest and the frozen shores of the far north, traditions survived that maintained a more accurate understanding of the supernatural forces that slumbered in the land of always winter. These free folk, as they called themselves, had never enjoyed the protection of the wall or the illusion of safety it provided, remaining constantly aware that the world contained dangers that transcended normal human understanding. The most significant of these preservers of ancient wisdom was a wildling named Craster, whose isolated keep stood in a clearing carved from the haunted forest many leagues beyond the wall. This crude and brutal man had somehow discovered or inherited knowledge of how to survive in close proximity to the other's domain, maintaining an arrangement that would have horrified the civilized folk of the Seven Kingdoms had they been aware of its existence. Craster's pact with the White Walkers represented a dark mirror of the accommodations that may have been made during the Night's King's reign, suggesting that such arrangements were not unique aberrations, but rather recurring patterns in humanity's relationship with the supernatural. The terms of Craster's agreement with the others were both simple and horrifying in their implications. In exchange for being left unmolested by the creatures that haunted the far north, he would provide them with sacrifices in the form of his own male children, abandoning the infants in the woods to be collected by beings whose purposes remained as mysterious as their nature. This practice which Craster justified to himself and others as a form of religious observance, represented one of the few direct forms of communication between human and other that continued during the long centuries of apparent peace. The psychological impact of maintaining such an arrangement gradually transformed Craster into something that bore little resemblance to ordinary humanity, though whether this change resulted from prolonged exposure to supernatural influence, or simply from the moral corruption inherent in his actions, remained unclear. His wives, the daughters he had sired through incestuous relationships, spoke of him in terms that suggested they viewed him as something more than human, referring to his sacrificed sons as offerings to gods whose nature they did not dare to question too closely. The existence of Craster's pact provided crucial evidence that the White Walkers had never truly disappeared, but had instead entered a period of dormancy or strategic withdrawal that allowed them to maintain their strength while avoiding detection by the increasingly complacent defenders of the wall. The regular provision of human infants suggested that the others required such offerings for purposes related to their own reproduction or the maintenance of their supernatural abilities, implying a dependency that might be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge and courage to attempt such a dangerous gambit. Beyond Craster's Keep, other wildling cultures preserved fragments of the old knowledge in forms that ranged from practical survival techniques to religious practices that acknowledged the continued existence of forces beyond normal understanding. Some clans maintained traditions of burning their dead to prevent unwanted resurrection, while others told stories that accurately described the appearance and abilities of White Walkers. Despite having no direct contact with such beings for countless generations, these oral traditions served as a repository of information that would prove invaluable when the ancient threats finally stirred from their long slumber. The gradual southward migration of wildling populations during this period reflected their growing awareness that something was changing in the far north, though the exact nature of this change remained unclear even to those most sensitive to supernatural influences. Clans that had roamed the same territories for centuries began to abandon their traditional ranges, moving steadily toward the wall in a pattern that would eventually culminate in the great gathering that brought tens of thousands of free folk together under the leadership of Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. This migration was not driven by any single catastrophic event, but rather by a growing sense of unease that permeated the consciousness of those who lived closest to the land of always winter. Reports began to circulate among the wildling clans of strange lights seen dancing in the northern sky, of unusual patterns in the behavior of animals and of dreams shared by multiple individuals that spoke of ancient threats stirring in the ice. These signs, dismissed as superstition by the more civilized inhabitants of the Seven Kingdoms, were taken seriously by people whose survival had always depended upon their ability to recognize and respond to subtle changes in their environment. The wall itself began to exhibit subtle changes during this period that would have been significant to observers trained to recognize such things, though the depleted and increasingly ignorant Night's Watch failed to notice or understand their implications. The barrier's supernatural properties, which had remained stable for thousands of years, showed signs of fluctuation that suggested the magical forces bound within its construction were responding to influences originating from beyond its protection. These changes were too subtle to be detected by casual observation, but would have been apparent to anyone possessing the knowledge and sensitivity that had once been common among the Order's leadership. The ancient spells and protective enchantments that had been woven into the wall's foundation during its original construction began to show signs of strain as forces that had remained dormant for millennia slowly began to stir once again. The foundation stones inscribed with symbols from the old tongue exhibited increased activity, their carved markings occasionally glowing with faint light during the darkest hours of winter nights. These manifestations were typically dismissed by the few who witnessed them as tricks of moonlight or the effects of alcohol, but they represented early warnings of changes that would soon reshape the world in ways that no living person could anticipate or prepare for. The long sleep was coming to an end, though those who should have been watching for such signs had forgotten how to recognize them or understand their significance. The White Walkers were beginning to stir in their frozen strongholds, responding to influences and following timetables that operated according to logic no human mind could fully comprehend. The age of forgetting was drawing to a close, and the realm of the living would soon be reminded that some threats never truly disappear, but merely wait for the right moment to emerge from the shadows and reclaim their place in the world of ice and fire. The first signs that the long age of dormancy was drawing to an end came not as dramatic revelations or obvious supernatural manifestations, but as subtle changes in the natural order that only the most observant could detect, and fewer still could properly interpret. In the deepest wilderness beyond the wall, where even the hardiest wildling clans rarely ventured, ancient forces that had slumbered for millennia began to stir with a patience and deliberation that spoke to intelligence far removed from human understanding. The land of always winter, that frozen realm where summer never came and the very air seemed to crystallize with supernatural cold, witnessed the first movements of beings whose awakening would soon reshape the fate of all living creatures in the known world. The Rangers of the Night's Watch, diminished though their ranks had become, were among the first to encounter evidence that something fundamental had changed in the territories they were sworn to patrol. These hardy men, who had dedicated their lives to watching for threats that most of their contemporaries dismissed as legend, found themselves confronting signs that challenged their understanding of what was possible in a world they thought they knew. The changes were initially so subtle that many dismissed them as natural variations in weather patterns or the normal fluctuations that occurred in any wild landscape. But a few among them possessed the experience and intuition necessary to recognize that they were witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented. Will, a young ranger whose family had served the Night's Watch for generations, became an unwitting witness to one of the first confirmed appearances of White Walkers in thousands of years during what should have been a routine patrol beyond the wall. The mission had begun, like countless others before it, with a small group of experienced men venturing into the haunted forest to investigate reports of wildling activity and to maintain the Watch's presence in territories that had grown increasingly dangerous as strange rumors filtered down from the far north. The patrol's discovery of a wildling camp that had been systematically destroyed marked the beginning of an encounter that would forever change how the Night's Watch understood the nature of the threats they faced. The scene that greeted Will and his companions defied explanation through conventional military logic, displaying a precision and deliberation that spoke to intelligence behind the destruction. The bodies of the free folk had been arranged in patterns that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple intimidation, their positions suggesting ritual significance that no human army would have bothered to create. The corpses themselves exhibited characteristics that troubled the experienced rangers more than the fact of their death. For these were men and women who had survived in some of the harshest conditions imaginable, yet they showed expressions of terror so profound that it seemed to have frozen their features at the moment of death. More disturbing still was the complete absence of any signs of struggle or resistance, as if the victims had been so overwhelmed by whatever they encountered that they had been unable to mount any defense against their attackers. When the patrol made camp to investigate the scene more thoroughly, the true nature of what they faced began to reveal itself in ways that challenged every assumption they had carried about the relative safety of their position. The temperature around the abandoned wildling camp began to drop with unnatural rapidity, far beyond what could be explained by normal weather patterns or the approach of night. The very air seemed to thicken with cold that penetrated through layers of fur and leather to chill the bones of men who had spent their entire lives acclimated to the harsh northern climate. The attack, when it came, unfolded with a terrible silence that would haunt Will's memory for the brief remainder of his life. The White Walkers emerged from the darkness between the trees like winter-given form, moving with a grace and purpose that spoke to intelligence far beyond anything the Rangers had been trained to combat. Their appearance matched the descriptions preserved in the oldest texts housed in Castle Black's library, though no written account could have prepared living men for the reality of facing beings whose very presence seemed to drain warmth and hope from the world around them. Sir Waymar Royce, the young knight who commanded the patrol, attempted to face the supernatural threat with the courage and honor that his noble upbringing had instilled in him, drawing his sword and calling upon his men to stand their ground against enemies that transcended normal understanding. His blade, forged of the finest steel and honed to razor sharpness, shattered like glass when it met the ice weapon wielded by the White Walker who confronted him. The supernatural cold of the other's sword, proving more than sufficient to destroy any conventional weapon that dared to challenge it. The slaughter that followed demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of the White Walkers in direct combat, their supernatural strength and speed making mockery of human martial training and courage. Gerd, the eldest member of the patrol, and a man whose experience encompassed decades of ranging beyond the wall, fell beneath claws that moved faster than human eyes could follow, his death serving as brutal confirmation that conventional tactics and weapons offered no hope against such enemies. Will himself survived the encounter only by virtue of his position as a scout, watching from concealment, as his companions were systematically destroyed by beings whose casual efficiency in dealing death spoke to experience accumulated over countless centuries. The horror he witnessed transcended mere violence, revealing itself as something that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which human civilization was built. The White Walkers killed not out of anger or necessity, but with the detached professionalism of creatures performing a task that had been assigned to them by purposes beyond mortal comprehension. The resurrection of the wildling dead marked the true beginning of Will's understanding of what the realm faced. As corpses that had lain still in the frozen ground began to stir with new and terrible purpose, the whites that rose at their master's command retained none of their former humanity. Moving with mechanical precision that spoke to absolute obedience, to wills that brooked no resistance or hesitation. Their eyes blazed with the same cold blue fire that marked their supernatural commanders, while their movements displayed strength that exceeded anything they had possessed in life. Will's escape from the massacre site became a desperate flight through wilderness that had been transformed from merely dangerous to actively hostile by the presence of creatures that existed outside the natural order. Every shadow might conceal enemies that moved without sound. Every change in temperature might herald the approach of beings whose touch brought death and whose presence turned the very air into an enemy that sought to freeze the breath in his lungs. The journey back to the wall tested not only his physical endurance but his sanity, as the magnitude of what he had witnessed struggled to find accommodation within a mind that had been shaped by a world where such things were impossible. The wall itself, when Will finally reached its protective shadow, seemed to offer sanctuary from the horrors he had witnessed, though the young ranger carried with him the terrible knowledge that even this massive barrier might prove insufficient against enemies who commanded powers that transcended normal understanding. His attempts to report what he had seen to his superiors within the Night's Watch met with skepticism and disbelief, for the tale he told seemed too fantastic to credit, and the evidence he could provide too limited to overcome centuries of accumulated doubt about the reality of supernatural threats. The decision to desert his post, which would ultimately cost Will his life when he was captured by the Starks of Winterfell, reflected not cowardice, but a rational assessment of his situation by a man who understood that staying to face such enemies again would accomplish nothing beyond adding his own corpse to their growing army. His flight southward represented one of the first attempts to warn the realm of what was stirring beyond the wall, though the manner of his capture and execution ensured that his message would not reach those who possessed the authority and resources necessary to mount an effective response. Lord Eddard Stark's execution of Will as a deserter from the Night's Watch followed the ancient laws and customs that governed such matters, yet it also represented a tragic missed opportunity to learn about threats that would soon emerge to challenge everything the realm held dear. The young ranger's final words, speaking of White Walkers and armies of the dead, were dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by fear and isolation, though they contained warnings that would prove prophetic in ways that no one present could have imagined. The death of Will marked only the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself countless times in the months and years that followed, as other members of the Night's Watch encountered evidence of supernatural activity, only to find their reports dismissed or ignored by superiors who had lost the knowledge necessary to recognize such threats. The institutional amnesia that had developed within the Order during the long centuries of peace would prove one of the greatest obstacles to mounting an effective response to the return of enemies whose very existence challenged the foundations of the world that had forgotten them. Meanwhile, beyond the wall, the White Walkers continued their systematic emergence from the deep places where they had waded through the long age of human complacency. Their movements followed patterns that spoke to strategic intelligence and long-term planning as they began to establish control over territories that had been abandoned by wildling clans fleeing southward in response to instincts they could not name but dared not ignore. The ancient enemy was awakening from its millennia-long slumber, and the realm of the living would soon discover that some threats never truly disappear, but merely wait for the proper moment to reclaim their place in a world that had been foolish enough to believe itself safe from the darkness that dwells beyond the light of civilization. The systematic emergence of the White Walkers from their ancient strongholds in the land of always winter marked the beginning of a campaign that would demonstrate both their patient intelligence and their devastating effectiveness against enemies who had forgotten how to recognize supernatural threats. Unlike their first appearance during the Long Night, when they had emerged as a chaotic force of destruction driven by alien purposes, this return revealed creatures who had learned from their previous defeat and adapted their strategies to exploit the weaknesses they observed in human civilization. The coordinated nature of their reappearance became evident as reports began to filter back to Castle Black from the few rangers who survived encounters with beings that should not have existed according to the conventional wisdom of their age. These sightings followed patterns that spoke to deliberate strategy rather than random emergence, with White Walkers appearing at locations that would maximize their impact while minimizing the chances of organized resistance from the depleted forces of the Night's Watch. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, one of the few remaining leaders who possessed both the authority and the wisdom to recognize the magnitude of the threat facing the realm, made the fateful decision to lead a great ranging beyond the wall with the largest force the Night's Watch could muster. This expedition, comprising nearly 300 men drawn from the Order's dwindling ranks, represented both a desperate attempt to gather intelligence about the supernatural threat and a tragic demonstration of how unprepared humanity had become for warfare against enemies that existed outside the natural order. The destination chosen for this ranging was the Fist of the First Men, an ancient ring fort whose origins predated written history and whose strategic position offered commanding views of the surrounding wilderness. This site, with its crown of standing stones that seemed to pulse with their own inner power, had been selected not only for its defensive advantages, but also for its connection to the deep history of humanity's previous struggle against the forces of ice and death. The choice would prove both symbolically appropriate and tactically disastrous, in ways that none of the expedition's leaders could have anticipated. The march to the Fist proceeded without significant incident, though experienced rangers noted subtle changes in the wilderness that suggested the presence of influences beyond normal understanding. The usual sounds of wildlife had diminished to an unnatural degree, while the very air seemed to carry a chill that penetrated deeper than mere temperature could explain. These signs, dismissed by many as the normal variations of weather and season, represented early warnings of the supernatural forces that were already moving to encircle the Night's Watch expedition. The establishment of camp atop the Fist followed standard military procedures that had served the Night's Watch well in countless previous ranging missions, yet these conventional preparations would prove utterly inadequate against enemies who commanded powers that transcended normal tactical considerations. The ancient stones that crowned the hill seemed to offer both protection and an ominous reminder of previous conflicts fought on the same ground, their weathered surfaces bearing carvings that few among the expedition possessed the knowledge to interpret correctly. Sam Tarley, the Maester's steward, whose scholarly inclinations had made him something of an expert on the Night's Watch's history and traditions, spent considerable time studying these ancient monuments during the expedition's brief occupation of the site. His research, conducted among texts that preserved fragments of knowledge from the Age of Heroes, revealed disturbing parallels between the current situation and accounts of the Long Night that most of his contemporaries dismissed as legend rather than historical fact. The discovery of dragonglass weapons buried beneath the Fist provided the first concrete evidence that previous generations had faced threats requiring supernatural countermeasures, though the significance of this find was not immediately apparent to most members of the expedition. These obsidian blades, wrapped in Night's Watch cloaks and hidden in a cache that had remained undisturbed for centuries, represented a direct link to the ancient knowledge that had been largely forgotten during the long years of peace and complacency. The attack, when it finally came, unfolded with a coordination and overwhelming force that shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of the enemy the Night's Watch faced. The assault began in the deepest hours of the night, when the expedition's sentries found themselves confronting shapes that moved through the darkness with purpose and intelligence that exceeded anything they had been trained to expect from wildling raiders or natural predators. The first indication that this was no ordinary attack came with the unnatural silence that preceded the assault, a quiet so complete that it seemed to swallow sound itself and replace it with a tension that made every man's nerves scream with anticipation of violence. The very air grew thick with cold that turned breath to visible vapor and made weapons brittle in hands that struggled to maintain their grip despite years of conditioning to the harsh northern climate. The White Walkers emerged from the surrounding wilderness like winter given form, their pale figures seeming to materialize from shadows that had been empty moments before. Their advance followed no pattern recognizable to human military doctrine, yet it demonstrated a tactical sophistication that spoke to intelligence honed through centuries of warfare against enemies they understood far better than those enemies understood them. The whites that accompanied their supernatural masters represented a force unlike anything the Night's Watch had prepared to combat, moving with mechanical precision that spoke to absolute obedience, while displaying strength that exceeded anything they had possessed in life. These reanimated corpses showed no fear, felt no pain, and required no rest, pressing their attack with relentless determination that broke against human defenses like waves against a crumbling seawall. The battle itself became a desperate struggle for survival, rather than any coherent military engagement, as the conventional tactics and weapons that had served the Night's Watch against human enemies proved woefully inadequate against supernatural foes. Steel blades that should have cut through flesh and bone shattered against the ice weapons wielded by the White Walkers, while arrows and crossbow bolts that found their marks seemed to have no effect on enemies who existed beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. Lord Commander Mormont's efforts to maintain order and coordinate a fighting retreat demonstrated the courage and leadership that had made him one of the most respected figures in the Night's Watch. Yet even his considerable abilities could not overcome the fundamental mismatch between human military doctrine and the realities of supernatural warfare. The expedition's formation collapsed under pressure that no conventional enemy could have sustained, as men trained to fight as disciplined units found themselves facing foes that moved with inhuman speed and struck with otherworldly strength. The few survivors who managed to escape the massacre at the Fist carried with them not only the trauma of witnessing humanity's military helplessness against supernatural enemies, but also crucial intelligence about the nature of the threat facing the realm. Their accounts, initially dismissed by many as the ravings of men driven mad by defeat and loss, provided the first detailed descriptions of White Walker capabilities and tactics that had been recorded since the end of the Long Night. Sam Tarly's survival, achieved through a combination of luck, cowardice, and the protection offered by his scholarly understanding of ancient threats, marked a crucial turning point in humanity's struggle against the returning darkness. His encounter with a White Walker during the retreat from the Fist provided the first practical demonstration that the ancient knowledge preserved in dusty texts could still serve as an effective weapon against enemies that most had believed to be mythical. The dragonglass dagger that Sam used to destroy his supernatural attacker represented more than just a weapon. It served as proof that the old ways and ancient wisdom retained their power despite centuries of neglect and disbelief. The White Walker's destruction, achieved through a single desperate thrust of an obsidian blade, demonstrated that these seemingly invincible enemies possessed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge and courage to act upon it. The aftermath of the battle at the Fist sent shockwaves through the remaining leadership of the Night's Watch, forcing them to confront the reality that their order faced enemies against whom conventional military wisdom offered no protection. The loss of nearly the entire ranging force represented not just a tactical defeat, but a fundamental challenge to everything the Watch believed about its role and capabilities in defending the realm. The intelligence gathered during this disastrous expedition revealed that the White Walkers had returned not as isolated individuals, but as an organized force with clear strategic objectives and the supernatural capabilities necessary to achieve them. Their systematic approach to warfare, combined with their ability to raise fallen enemies as additions to their own army, suggested that humanity faced a threat that would only grow stronger with each victory the others achieved. The survivors' reports of the vast army of whites that had overwhelmed the Fist spoke to recruitment capabilities that transcended anything human civilization could match through conventional means. Every graveyard, every battlefield, every place where the dead lay buried represented a potential source of reinforcements for enemies who viewed death not as an ending, but as an opportunity to expand their military strength. The strategic implications of facing an enemy that grew stronger through victory while suffering no permanent losses through defeat forced a fundamental reevaluation of how the realm might hope to survive the return of threats that had once required the combined efforts of all humanity to overcome. The White Walkers had emerged from their long slumber more dangerous than ever before, and the world of the living would need to rediscover ancient knowledge and forge new alliances if it hoped to avoid the extinction that now seemed to loom ever closer with each passing day. The systematic expansion of White Walker influence throughout the lands beyond the Wall reached its inevitable culmination when the ancient barrier that had protected the Seven Kingdoms for 8,000 years finally faced a direct assault from enemies who possessed both the power and determination necessary to overcome humanity's greatest defensive achievement. The breach of the wall represented far more than a simple military victory. It marked the end of an age of relative safety and the beginning of a new chapter in the eternal struggle between the forces of life and death that had shaped the history of the known world since its earliest days. The acquisition of an undead dragon by the Night King transformed the strategic situation in ways that no human military planner could have anticipated or prepared for. Viserion, once one of Daenerys Targaryen's 3 beloved children, had fallen to an ice spear hurled with supernatural accuracy during the desperate mission to capture a white as proof of the White Walker threat. The dragon's death in the frozen waters beyond the wall had seemed tragic enough, but its resurrection as a creature of ice and shadow represented a catastrophe whose implications extended far beyond the loss of a single powerful ally. The process by which the Night King raised Viserion from death demonstrated powers that exceeded even the most dire warnings contained in the ancient texts that spoke of the long night and its terrors, where the resurrection of human and animal corpses had required physical contact or close proximity. The dragon was restored to a terrible semblance of life through what appeared to be an act of pure will, its massive form rising from the depths of the frozen lake in response to commands that transcended normal understanding of how death and undeath functioned. The transformation that overtook Viserion during his resurrection created something that bore only superficial resemblance to the magnificent creature he had been in life. His scales, once golden and warm to the touch, became pale as winter ice and radiated cold that could be felt from great distances. His eyes, previously filled with the intelligence and fierce loyalty that marked all dragons, now blazed with the same blue fire that characterized all servants of the White Walker cause, speaking to a fundamental change in both nature and allegiance that placed him beyond any hope of redemption or return to his former state. Most significantly, the fire that had once flowed from Viserion's throat like liquid sunlight was replaced by something far more sinister and destructive. The undead dragon's breath weapon consisted of flames so cold they appeared blue, capable of freezing rather than burning anything they touched, while possessing the supernatural power necessary to destroy magical barriers that had resisted all other forms of assault for millennia. This ice fire represented a perversion of one of nature's most fundamental forces, turning the life-giving power of dragon flame into an instrument of death and destruction. The Night King's mastery of his new mount proved immediate and absolute, their partnership demonstrating a level of coordination that suggested the dragon's resurrection had created more than simple obedience, but rather a form of supernatural communion that allowed perfect understanding between rider and steed. This bond enabled tactical capabilities that no human dragon rider could hope to match, as the Night King could direct Viserion's movements with precision that made them appear to share a single consciousness, focused entirely on the destruction of everything that stood in their path. The march toward the wall proceeded with the inexorable patience that had characterized all White Walker movements since their return from the depths of winter. Yet now their advance carried with it the certainty of ultimate success that had been absent from their previous campaigns. The growing army of whites that accompanied the Night King represented not just the accumulated dead from recent battles, but also the systematic harvesting of every graveyard, battlefield, and burial ground they had encountered during their journey southward. The psychological impact of this massive force of undead warriors extended far beyond their simple military capabilities, as reports of their advance carried with them descriptions that challenged the sanity of those who witnessed the spectacle. Survivors spoke of an army that stretched beyond the horizon, moving with mechanical precision that created sounds like the grinding of enormous gears or the creaking of ship timbers, stressed beyond their breaking point. The sight of so many dead walking with purpose and direction violated fundamental assumptions about the natural order in ways that broke the minds of some who encountered it. The inclusion of undead giants among the White Walker forces represented a particularly disturbing development, as these massive creatures had been extinct in the wild for generations, and their resurrection demonstrated the other's ability to draw upon deaths that had occurred long before their current campaign began. These towering whites possessed strength that exceeded even their living counterparts, capable of wielding weapons that no ordinary soldier could hope to lift, while displaying none of the intelligence or individual personality that had made giants such fascinating subjects for human study and legend. The approach to Eastwatch by the Sea marked the beginning of the final phase of the White Walker campaign against the Wall, as the Night King selected this easternmost castle as the point where his forces would make their definitive breach of humanity's ancient barrier. The choice of target demonstrated strategic thinking that took into account both the relative weakness of this position compared to more heavily fortified sections of the wall and the symbolic significance of breaking through at a location that commanded views of the sea beyond. The garrison at East Watch by the Sea, like their brothers at other castles along the wall, had received reports of the approaching supernatural army, but lacked both the numbers and the weapons necessary to mount any meaningful resistance against enemies who commanded powers that transcended normal military capabilities. The few dozen men stationed at the castle represented all that remained of a force that had once numbered in the thousands, their depleted ranks reflecting the long decline of the Night's Watch and the realm's forgetting of the true threats that lurked beyond their ancient barrier. The assault itself began with a demonstration of aerial superiority that no human army could hope to counter through conventional means. Viserion's attack runs against the wall's defenses showcased the devastating effectiveness of ice fire against fortifications that had been designed to withstand earthbound assaults, but had never been intended to resist attack. From above, the undead dragon's breath weapon proved capable of destroying not just the physical structure of the wall, but also the magical protections that had been woven into its foundation during the original construction. The men of Eastwatch fought with courage that honored the traditions of their order, loosing arrows and crossbow bolts at a target that soared far above their effective range, while calling upon horn signals that had not been used in earnest for thousands of years. Their resistance, though doomed from the outset, served as a final testament to the dedication and sacrifice that had motivated the Night's Watch throughout its long history of service to the realm, even as that service was about to end in failure and death. The destruction of the wall at Eastwatch proceeded with methodical thoroughness that revealed the Night King's understanding of both the barrier's construction and the most effective means of ensuring its complete breach, rather than simply creating a gap large enough for his forces to pass through. Viserion's assault systematically undermined the magical foundations that maintained the entire structure's integrity, causing sections of the wall to collapse in a cascade of destruction that extended far beyond the immediate target area. The sound of the wall's destruction carried across the seven kingdoms like thunder, a rumbling that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the earth, and spoke to changes that would affect every living creature south of the ancient barrier. Those who heard it, whether they understood its significance or not, felt a chill that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the instinctive recognition that something fundamental about their world had been irrevocably altered. The passage of the White Walker army through the breach represented the fulfillment of prophecies and warnings that had been dismissed as legend for thousands of years, as beings of ice and shadow set foot upon soil that had been protected from their presence since the dawn of recorded history. The very ground seemed to freeze beneath their feet, while the air around them crystallized with cold that turned moisture into dancing particles of ice that reflected their pale forms like fragments of a shattered mirror. The transformation of the landscape that accompanied the White Walker advance into the seven kingdoms demonstrated powers that extended far beyond simple military conquest, as winter itself seemed to follow in their wake with unnatural persistence and severity. Rivers that had never frozen began to turn to ice, while snow fell with increasing frequency and accumulation that defied all normal patterns of seasonal change. The very climate of Westeros began to shift in response to the presence of creatures whose nature was so fundamentally opposed to life and warmth that their mere existence altered the natural order around them. The strategic implications of the wall's breach extended far beyond the immediate military threat posed by the White Walker army, as the psychological impact of this ancient barrier's failure sent shockwaves throughout the Seven Kingdoms that would influence every subsequent decision made by leaders who suddenly found themselves facing enemies they had believed to be mythical. The protection that had allowed civilization to flourish in relative safety for 8 millennia had been swept away in a single night, leaving the realm defenseless against threats that no living person possessed the experience or knowledge necessary to combat effectively. The Night King's success in breaching the wall represented the culmination of planning and preparation that had extended across centuries of apparent dormancy, revealing that the White Walkers' withdrawal to the land of always winter had never been a true defeat, but rather a strategic repositioning that allowed them to gather strength and develop new capabilities for their inevitable return. The ancient enemy had learned from their previous defeat and adapted their methods to exploit the weaknesses they had observed in human civilization, emerging stronger and more dangerous than ever before. The realm of the living now faced the prospect of confronting an enemy that possessed not only supernatural powers and an ever-growing army of the dead, but also the aerial superiority provided by an undead dragon whose capabilities exceeded anything that could be deployed against it. The breach of the wall marked the beginning of what would prove to be the final confrontation between the forces of life and death, a battle whose outcome would determine whether the sun would ever again rise upon a world free from the dominion of ice and shadow. The convergence of all remaining forces of the living at Winterfell represented humanity's final, desperate gambit against an enemy whose power had grown beyond anything the realm had ever faced in its long and blood-soaked history. The ancient seat of House Stark, with its crypts full of stone kings and its godswood sheltering a heart tree that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless generations, became the focal point for a battle that would determine whether the world would continue to know the warmth of spring or be forever locked in the grip of an eternal winter that served the will of the dead. The army that gathered within Winterfell's walls brought together forces that had never before stood united under a single banner, their alliance forged not through politics or conquest, but through the shared recognition that survival itself depended upon setting aside old grudges and ancient rivalries. The Unsullied of Essos stood shoulder to shoulder with the Knights of Westeros, while Dothraki horsemen who had never seen snow prepared to charge against enemies that existed beyond their understanding of how warfare should be conducted. Daenerys Targaryen's dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, circled above the castle like living embodiments of fire and fury, their presence offering hope that ancient prophecies about ice and fire might yet prove accurate in predicting the outcome of this ultimate confrontation. Yet even these magnificent creatures, whose ancestors had once conquered the Seven Kingdoms through the application of overwhelming force, seemed small and vulnerable when measured against the vast army of the dead that approached from the north with the inexorable persistence of winter itself. The strategic preparations undertaken by the defenders reflected both their understanding of conventional military doctrine and their growing awareness that traditional tactics would prove insufficient against supernatural enemies. The trenches that surrounded Winterfell's walls were designed not merely to slow an advancing army, but to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where dragonglass weapons and fire could be employed to maximum effect against enemies that felt neither pain nor fear. Jon Snow's leadership of the coalition forces brought together his unique experience as both a member of the Night's Watch and a participant in the wars that had ravaged the Seven Kingdoms. Yet, even his considerable knowledge of both conventional and supernatural warfare seemed inadequate when measured against the scope of the threat approaching from beyond the broken wall. His understanding of White Walker capabilities, gained through personal encounters that had cost him friends and brothers, informed defensive strategies that represented humanity's best hope of survival. The arrival of the Night King's host at Winterfell began not with the clash of arms or the sound of war horns, but with a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow all sound and replace it with anticipation so thick it could be felt in the very air. The temperature around the castle began to plummet with supernatural rapidity, turning breath to visible vapor and making weapons brittle in hands that struggled to maintain their grip despite years of training in harsh northern conditions. The assault itself commenced with a coordination and overwhelming force that immediately challenged every assumption the defenders had made about their ability to resist through conventional military means. The Whites, that comprised the vast majority of the attacking force, moved with mechanical precision that spoke to absolute obedience, while displaying strength and endurance that exceeded anything they had possessed in life. These reanimated corpses showed no hesitation, felt no pain, and required no rest, pressing their attack with relentless determination that crashed against human defenses like an unstoppable tide. The trebuchets and other siege engines that the defenders had positioned around Winterfell's perimeter proved effective for only brief moments before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers that defied any rational calculation of military odds. The Whites seemed to regard obstacles and fortifications not as barriers to be overcome through tactical maneuvering, but simply as temporary delays to be endured while their inexhaustible numbers found ways around, over, or through whatever stood in their path. The lighting of the defensive trenches created a ring of fire around Winterfell that briefly offered hope that the ancient enemy's weakness to flame might provide salvation, yet this advantage proved temporary as the Whites demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice themselves in vast numbers to create bridges of their own bodies across the flaming barriers. The sight of the dead walking deliberately into fire that would have sent any living creature fleeing in terror, served as a stark reminder that the defenders faced enemies whose motivations and limitations existed outside normal understanding. The breach of Winterfell's walls came not through conventional siege warfare, but through the application of supernatural strength and numbers that no human fortification had ever been designed to withstand. Whites swarmed up the castle's defensive structures like insects, their claws finding purchase on stone surfaces that should have been impossible to climb, while their absolute lack of self-preservation allowed them to attempt assaults that would have been suicidal for any living army. The retreat into Winterfell's interior transformed the battle from a defensive siege into a desperate running fight through corridors and chambers that had been home to the Stark family for thousands of years. Every room became a potential battleground where the living fought with increasing desperation against enemies whose numbers seemed to multiply with each passing moment. As fallen defenders rose again to join the ranks of those who had killed them, Arya Stark's movement through the chaos of battle represented more than simple tactical maneuvering. It embodied the skills and training that had been forged through years of hardship and loss, culminating in this moment when all her accumulated knowledge and abilities would be tested against the ultimate challenge. Her progress toward the Godswood, where the Night King sought to complete his conquest by destroying the three-eyed raven, required navigating through a castle that had been transformed into a nightmare landscape where death stalked every shadow. The Godswood itself, with its ancient heart tree standing sentinel over secrets that predated human memory, became the stage for a confrontation that would determine the fate of all living things in the known world. The Night King's approach to this sacred space demonstrated the same methodical patience that had characterized all his actions since his return from the depths of winter, his 12 White Walker lieutenants surrounding him in a formation that spoke to both tactical awareness and ceremonial significance. Theon Greyjoy's final stand in defense of Bran Stark represented the culmination of a redemption arc that had seen the former heir to the Iron Islands transformed from arrogant prince to broken thrall to something approaching the hero. He might have been under different circumstances. His charge against the Night King, doomed though it was from the outset, served as a testament to the courage that could emerge from even the most unlikely sources when everything meaningful hung in the balance. The moment when the Night King reached for his sword to deliver the killing blow that would end the three-eyed raven's existence and secure his dominion over the world of the living, represented the closest approach to ultimate victory that the forces of death would achieve. The ancient enemy stood poised to complete a conquest that had been 8,000 years in the making, his pale fingers closing around a weapon that had ended countless lives and would soon claim the most significant prize of all. Arya's attack emerged from shadows and silence with the same lethal precision that had marked all her kills since her training began in the House of Black and White. Yet, this assault carried with it consequences that extended far beyond the simple elimination of a single target. Her leap toward the Night King represented not just personal courage, but the embodiment of humanity's refusal to surrender, even when facing certain extinction, a defiance that transcended individual survival to embrace something larger and more meaningful. The Night King's interception of her attack demonstrated reflexes and awareness that exceeded even Arya's considerable skills. His supernatural speed, allowing him to catch her mid-leap and lift her from the ground with strength that could have crushed her throat without effort. For a moment, that seemed to stretch into eternity. The fate of all living things hung in the balance as the ancient enemy prepared to add another corpse to his growing collection of trophies. The revelation of the Valyrian steel dagger concealed in Arya's other hand transformed what had appeared to be certain defeat into an opportunity that required split-second timing and absolute precision to exploit. Her desperate switch of the weapon from one hand to the other, a move practiced countless times during her training but never under such impossible circumstances, represented the difference between the continuation of life and the onset of eternal darkness. The blade's penetration of the Night King's defenses sent shockwaves through the supernatural bonds that connected him to every White Walker and White in existence, as the magic that had sustained the army of the dead for 8 millennia began to unravel with devastating speed. The ancient spells that had bound ice and shadow into forms capable of movement and purpose proved unable to survive the destruction of their ultimate source, creating a cascade of dissolution that spread outward from Winterfell to encompass every servant of the others throughout the known world. The Night King's destruction manifested not as simple death, but as a complete rejection of the unnatural forces that had sustained his existence since the desperate ritual that had created him in the depths of prehistory. His form shattered like ice struck by flame, dissolving into fragments that caught the light for a moment before disappearing entirely, leaving behind only empty air where moments before had stood the greatest threat the world had ever known. The simultaneous destruction of every White Walker created a spectacle that defied normal understanding, as beings who had existed for millennia simply ceased to be in the span of heartbeats. Their dissolution followed the same pattern as their master's destruction, each pale form fracturing and disappearing as the magic that had given them purpose and power found itself suddenly bereft of the source that had maintained its coherence across the centuries. The collapse of the White Army followed immediately upon the destruction of their supernatural commanders, as corpses that had been animated by powers beyond death simply returned to their natural state of motionless decay. The vast host that had threatened to overwhelm all resistance crumpled to the ground like marionettes whose strings had been cut, leaving behind only ordinary bones and rotting flesh that posed no threat to anyone. The silence that followed the end of the battle possessed a quality unlike anything the survivors had ever experienced, as if the very air had been cleansed of influences that had tainted it with supernatural malevolence. The oppressive cold that had accompanied the White Walker advance began to dissipate almost immediately, replaced by the normal chill of a winter night that felt warm by comparison to the unnatural freeze that had gripped the castle during the height of the assault. The victory achieved at Winterfell represented more than simple military triumph. It marked the final resolution of a conflict that had shaped the destiny of the known world since the dawn of recorded history. The threat that had once driven humanity to the brink of extinction and forced the construction of the wall itself had been eliminated, not through massive armies or ancient prophecies, but through the courage and skill of a single person whose determination to protect those she loved had overcome impossible odds. Thus ends the chronicle of the White Walkers, beings who haunted Westeros for 8 millennia, from their creation and desperation to their final destruction in the very place where the long struggle began. Their story remains one of the most profound in the history of the known world. They served as a reminder that some threats transcend the petty squabbles of kings and queens, that survival itself sometimes demands the impossible unity of ancient enemies. Though the Night King fell and his army crumbled to dust, the lessons of their existence endure. The courage of those who stood against the darkness, the sacrifice required to preserve the light, and the knowledge that even the most ancient evils can be overcome through determination and hope. In the silence that now reigns beyond the wall, where once the dead marched in terrible purpose, peace has returned to the realm of the living. The White Walkers have passed into legend once more, but this time their story is complete.